So that was Alice Paul and the 19th Amendment. So that's women's right, direct action. And TR square deal, Wilson, new freedom. All right, sorry about that. I really thought I hit record. Next, let's go down to the National Origins Act. And that was passed in 1924, and they hit that really nativist time, but that is, this was the first or the second immigration restriction on immigrations passed since the Chinese Exclusion Act some 40 years earlier. And this would set limits or quotas on immigrants from certain parts of the world. The big thing was it limited from every place outside of Northern or Western Europe. And even then, that was a little bit shaky in Northern and Western Europe for some of the very racist people in the United States. So this was the National Origins Act to not only keep out dangerous immigrants who they saw were as inferior and they'd be more susceptible to bring things like anarchism or communism or Bolshevism. Remember that the first Red Scare happened at the same time, but also this was, like I told you before, the most racist time in history. And the idea was that they didn't want inferior races to taint superior American white Protestant blood. And that was the theory of eugenics that started in the United States, that the whole idea is that superior races should not allow interbreeding, and interbreeding between inferior races. So people from Southern or Eastern Europe, or for that matter, than any place else in the world. And soon that not allowing for interbreeding would turn into we should selectively breed and make sure that Americans of Northern European descent only marry Americans of Northern European descent, and we can't allow inferiors in, and this had a great effect on the Nazis. Oh, I should add, the National Origins Act and eugenics is social Darwinism to the extreme. Well, I'm sorry about recording. Thank you for reminding me. Gosh, I really thought I hit it. Okay, Pomerades. So that is the first Red Scare. And remember the thing about total war. In total war, once you have total war, there's going to be, just a sec, I misread something. Okay, in total war, there's that idea you're bringing up hate and finding the enemy, and that's looking for this enemy within. And so don't forget, the Red Scare applies directly to total war because they could not turn it off when the war ended. And since socialists were opposed to the war and socialist-leaning unions were opposed to the war, they became the enemies just as much as Germans or Austrians became enemies. And that's where you get things like lynchings and Debs being arrested, and the Espionage Act and all those people being arrested in the United States. Frank Little, the Wobbly, lynched in Butte. So that's the first thing I wanted to get. But then after the war, there was a wave of anarchist terrorist attacks all over the world, but especially the United States, culminating with one of the biggest attacks on Wall Street in 1920. And there was a bomb that actually was sent to a mail bomb to Attorney General Palmer's house that exploded, and he was wounded. And so this would trigger this great fear that there is a communist revolution coming. And now, because the Bolshevik Revolution had succeeded and they were winning their civil war, this revolution could happen here. And so they began a series of raids to crack down on un-American thinking. And the target was dangerous immigrants, but also people from, just a sec, okay, but also labor unions. And the Palmer raids and the Red Scare turned into an anti-labor union attack. Remember the bomb-throwing anarchist thing? Well, now labor unions are a bunch of Reds or Bolsheviks. And this would turn into a union busting and fit very much in the conservative or trickle-down economics of that time. And so those are the two biggies there. Is there another question? Is there another question?
We got a couple more in the chat.
My thing was froze. That's one thing I had to quick scramble for one meeting about graduation, where they're trying to decide if they're going to how they're going to do it, and then they're going to allow some teachers into the building, so we had to learn all about that, about wearing masks. So let's get to conservative presidents. And so these are the conservative presidents of the 1920s, and that is Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover. The three Republican presidents of this very Republican conservative decade of the 1920s. And the two big things you need to know about it is that all three presidents believed in trickle-down economics, which is conservative economics, and all three had that more conservative social look of the idea of, let's get back to when society was more stable. Let's get back to when people knew their place and get away from all the effects of the war, of the radical changes of the progressive era, but also the Spanish flu that hit them. And so this really big conservative reaction. And the big thing that tied them all together, all three presidents, was they all three had, at least until 1931, the same Secretary of the Treasury, Andrew Mellon, who is in many ways the inventor of conservative economics. And that is why these conservative, and then Harding had returned to normalcy was his campaign pledge, which nobody really knows what it means. But the idea is no more looking or trying to, no more trying to change everything. Let's go back to the way things were. And so you see that with conservative presidents all the way to the current president now. Next, the Bracero or the Zoot Suit Wars. And so where are we at here? Okay, that's near the bottom of it. And the Bracero was a program to allow for temporary workers who would be legal immigrants from Mexico, mostly, to come in and do work on farms, because so many of the farm workers had taken, so many of the agricultural workers in the United States had taken jobs at defense plants. And so the thought was it would come a way to document legal immigrants from Mexico to come into the United States. And that was never really an issue before. Those workers came in. And so when you start hearing the thing about undocumented workers to this day, that came out of the Bracero program to allow workers in. And this led to a significant number of people from Mexico coming to the United States, even though there were still restrictions of immigration because of the National Origins Act, which would not end until 1968. And this is where so much of the whole idea of illegal immigrants and everything will come from today. And the Zoot Suit riots were part, in June of 1943, of racially tinged riots all over the United States. There was a huge riot of whites attacking blacks in Detroit, for example, at the same time. But this is June of 1943 in Los Angeles, where mostly gangs of young white men, especially sailors, it was a big harbor, lots of sailors there, began attacking people they saw as young men of Mexican descent. The thought was they were taking their jobs while they go fight, they're working here, and also a big, significant amount of racism and prejudice. And zoot suits were a very prominent suit that a lot of young people wore, but it would be stereotyped that a lot of young people of young Mexican Americans would wear. But don't forget, this was part of race riots all over. And it was kind of these waves of race riots, especially we'll see it in the 1960s. Next, Munich 38. So that's a little bit further up. And Munich in 38, that, one thing real quick, that would become the equivalent to appeasement. Munich 38, appeasement, giving into aggression. And it was here that Germany, Italy, France, and Britain met. And at that meeting, especially Britain, Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of Britain, but also France would agree because Britain kind of left them no choice. They agreed to give in to Hitler's demands, and they gave the Sudetenland, which is the part of Western Czechoslovakia that there was the majority of the population there were German-speaking, ethnic German people. And Hitler demanded it or threatened war. They gave it to Hitler, and Hitler promised, signed a piece of paper saying, this is all I want. And so Chamberlain said, I've saved it, peace for our time. And of course, Hitler was lying. Hitler, once he saw they could get that, he would eventually take all of Czechoslovakia. And that would become the example of appeasement. And even though it was probably too late to stop war. Hitler wanted war and it was going to happen by 38. But this would become for years after the definition of appeasement. And it infuriated Stalin. He wasn't there. And Czechoslovakia was not even invited, and they just gave up part of their country. Next, the Filipino Insurrection. So that's near the top of that page. And after the United States got the Philippines from Spain, conquered it from Spain in the Treaty of Paris and the Spanish-American War, the Filipino Insurrection, these were Filipinos who thought they were going to be independent, and they would fight the United States colonizers, the United States Imperial Army, to try to win their independence in a bloody guerrilla war. And they were led by Emilio Aguinaldo. And Aguinaldo would lead this a fairly successful insurrection for a while. And the United States would resort to bloody tactics like torture and concentration camps and massacre of civilians as reprisals for guerrilla attacks. And eventually Aguinaldo would be tricked and captured. And they agreed to finally end the war. But this convinced a lot of Americans that being a colonial imperial power was not worth it. And that would lead to more big stick diplomacy of economic imperialism. But over 300,000 people would die in this. So a bloody battle. 18th Amendment. So 18th Amendment, let's go down a little bit further. Where's the 18th Amendment? I lost the 18th Amendment. Well, I just sorry, I can't find the 18th Amendment. That's prohibition. 18th Amendment is prohibition, and that within the 1920s, the 18th Amendment, and prohibition would be enforced by the Volstead Act. The Volstead Act, and prohibition actually is a big progressive reform. The idea was drinking was awful, destroying families, immoral, but also business leaders wanted sober workers. And the great experiment would begin. And at first, a lot of people did begin to obey, but this led to organized crime, most famously Al Capone and the South Side Gang in Chicago, who would do bootlegging and led to intense violence. And a significant number of people became lawbreakers after that. Manhattan Project. So the Manhattan Project, that's near the bottom that's the bottom. The Manhattan Project was the building of the atomic bomb, and this massive program that would be $2 billion in direct costs and $2 billion in subsidiary costs, with this massive nationwide program to build the atomic bomb. And at Los Alamos, New Mexico, they would actually construct the bomb. They would refine uranium in Tennessee. The first chain reactor, the first nuclear reactor would be in Richland, Washington at the Tri-Rivers because of electricity there. And then they explode the bomb. And in July 16th, 1945, Trinity, the first atomic bomb explosion, would take place as a test in New Mexico. And that would be the prototype of all nuclear bombs. And the big reason for the Manhattan Project, the thought was they knew Germany might be building it, even though by 41, Germany basically quit. They didn't have the resources. But the United States kept building it, but the bomb was not ready before Germany surrendered and was destroyed. But the Japanese were still fighting, even though the Japanese military was completely defeated, and they were looking for a way to surrender by keeping they wanted to keep their emperor. So Japan was looking for a way to surrender. But the United States desperately wanted to end this war, especially before the Russians, who promised to enter at Yalta, came in, and they might get an occupation zone, and they didn't want that. The United States would use the atomic bomb on Japan. And Japan would surrender 6 days after the second atomic bomb was dropped. But the important thing to understand is that Japan was already militarily defeated. Their cities have been destroyed with fire bombings, and subs have blockaded them, and they were completely out of supplies. Okay, next. Executive Order 9909, Korematsu for the USA. 9906, I'm sorry, was Executive Order 9906. That was an executive order by President Roosevelt to intern Japanese Americans, and that's just near the bottom of that test review, 1890 to 1945, to intern Japanese Americans as a measure of war. And so Congress gave him the war-making power, and he did that. So there was no law passed by Congress. And this would, the order to have all Japanese Americans, immigrants or citizens, that didn't matter, along the West Coast, they would be taken to concentration camps. And many of them would lose everything they had. So a lot of non-Japanese American businessmen and farmers would take over their farms or their businesses. And a lot of people believe this was part of the reason for this. So they drive out competitors. But they would be interned, and in the court decision, Korematsu versus the United States, the Supreme Court ruled in a really controversial decision that this was a military measure and they have no voice in it because the Constitution says in times of war, the president is commander in chief and Congress makes the laws, so internment is okay. And so the Japanese did intern, or Japanese Americans were interned, even though the vast majority were citizens. And this is an example of total war. Total war, looking for dissent, looking for enemies. The United States did not go as far as other countries. I think you know what I mean, but yes, US did it too. I got a question. Exact dates on your essay. I'll tell you the thing about exact dates. That's a good piece of outside information. If you have the exact date down on your review list, put it in, or the year, put it in. If you don't know the exact year, put down an approximate, the 1890s or something like that. Don't make up a year. In 1986, the United States became independent. That will not work. So bits of outside information. Year is a good thing to have if you have it. That will really help. That'll put you in a time frame. And also by having the dates, you can show in your essay, this led to this, led to this. And that'll be a good, well-organized essay. It really, even in a time crunch like you're going to have with 45 minutes, if you get things out of order, it looks like you're not prepared. So that will help. All right, let's get up here. Final solution. So the final solution, this is another measure of total war. And this is what Germany would do in 1942 as an answer to what they called the Jewish question. And what this meant is that Germany, they had the racial policy of Jews were controlling communists. They were controlling all, they were too liberal. They were degrading the government. Jews were destabilizing the state, purifying the state. And before World War II, they tried to push them out with things like the Night of the Broken Glass and Nuremberg laws. But once war began and Germany began to conquer areas with large Jewish populations like Poland and the Soviet Union, then it became, what do we do with this enemy within? And that first they used Einsatzgruppen, special groups that would execute a lot of Jews. They also put them in ghettos, which purposely meant to starve them. But the thought was, as a measure of total war, we must get rid of this enemy within. And so that is the death camps. That is when they set up death camps. Almost all of them were in Poland, where they would use massive amounts of resource and prioritize these resources in insanity of this ideology to murder, the death camps, about 4.8 million Jews and another couple million other undesirables. And combined with others that would be executed or starved to death or worked to death, there would be over 6 million Jews killed. And it would be in the 1960s, more and more this we refer to as the Holocaust. Next question. Political machines, Tammany Hall. Oh, good one. And that's on the other sheet, isn't it? I think.
Yeah, that's
So
on page 5.
on page 5, political machines in Tammany Hall. And political machines, what that means is, usually in the city, but like Ohio was a political machine for the Republican Party. But it was one political party using their the power of government and other things to control a city. And it would be normally run by a boss. The boss would be the head of this. It'd be one political party would run a city. And the big reason why they were able to do that is because when the cities grew so fast, there were no resources, no services in the city. And in that vacuum, the machines came in. So the most famous machine was Tammany Hall. And the Democratic Party, there's a Democratic machine in New York City beginning in the late 1840s. They went and they provided help for immigrants, food, help for migrants coming from rural areas, provide them jobs, provide them with a place to live, give them a little security. And then eventually they would build the streets, the sewage system, schools, parks. The machines would do that. In return, this would buy loyalty of voters so they get the vote, but also the machines could turn around and it's called, remember the term graft, which literally means taking from or stealing public funds. And which still goes on to this day. But the idea was, okay, we'll give you these things, but we will also get rich off that. And yes, the machines provided a lot of public services. As years went on, though, the graft became more important than public services. Tammany Hall is the most famous one. But like Ohio was run by the Republican Party. Next, W.B. Du Bois and the NAACP. Is that on page? So that's on the other one. Okay. So it's about a third of the way down that 1890 to 1945 page. And Du Bois, I know it's not, that would not be the way you pronounce that, but this is America. He would be one of the most influential leaders of the fight to get equal rights for African Americans. Equal rights for African Americans. And the NAACP, which was the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which he helped create in 1911, the NAACP and Du Bois, their idea was African Americans will never have economic and legal protections unless they get equal rights. They need equal rights under the law. So their fight would be against all forms of discrimination in education, but especially the Jim Crow laws and the right to vote. And their idea was we can't do, or we just can't settle for a slightly better job. We need to fight for equal rights. And so Du Bois was one who said that we will not accept the post-Reconstruction America. We deserve the promises of Reconstruction and the promises of citizenship. And so it'd be the NAACP who would bring up the lawsuits that would eventually lead to, for example, Brown versus Topeka Board of Education. Booker T. Washington was another former slave, and he pushed a different idea. And this was best known on his, what's called the Atlanta Conference or the Atlanta Document or the Atlanta Doctrine, Atlanta Conference. In Atlanta, where he gave this speech where he laid out his idea, in essence, African Americans should abandon the fight for equal rights. It's a fight we won't win. And in that fight, we will be crushed. Instead, we should just demand a slightly better economic position, a bigger piece of the pie, so to speak, but not full rights. If we demand full rights, that will anger whites and the law enforcement system, and we'll never get ahead economically. And so that was Booker T. Washington's idea. And both him and Du Bois were pretty cold realists. And they looked at the situation and came up with something totally opposite. But you can imagine Booker T. Washington would be the one invited to visit President Roosevelt. The first time that ever happened. Du Bois was considered to be a communist. Next, big stick diplomacy. So let's get to that one. Big stick diplomacy, same page. Big stick diplomacy is economic imperialism of Latin America. Economic imperialism of Latin America. And what that meant is that what started under Franklin Roosevelt, or started under Teddy Roosevelt, and it would be personified by the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. And the Roosevelt corollary, remember the Monroe Doctrine said no European interference in the Western Hemisphere, and this goes back to 1823. Well, the Roosevelt corollary said the United States will give itself the power to be the policeman, the international policeman in Latin America. And so the United States is saying, we will decide what is good government, what is efficient government, and what is our actions that will hurt our hemisphere, aka the United States. And so the Roosevelt corollary. But what it meant is that the United States would use its power, the big stick, which was the Navy. Sometimes you see this called gunboat diplomacy, which was a British term. But the power of the Navy and the Marines to coerce governments in Latin America to allow for American economic dominance. That meant the biggie were banks, to force these countries to give all their money or to pay back their debt, even if it broke the country. And that would happen in the Dominican Republic in 1904, the first real example of this. But the company that would personify big stick diplomacy was United Fruit, the banana company, be known as the octopus. And the United States would intervene all over Latin America for banks or United Fruit. And this would happen most famously for every place from Cuba to Haiti, Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, heck, they invaded Guatemala, Mexico, economic imperialism. And would not really end, kind of end under Roosevelt, but come back under Dwight Eisenhower. Okay, Homestead Act. And so Homestead Act's on the other one, so let me get that one up. Okay, Homestead Act, it's in the middle of page 5. And that would pass during the Civil War. And what it was a very much of an old time, Jeffersonian Republican idea of giving everybody their own, everybody could become an independent farmer. And so the Republican Party that would be created during the 1850s, the Free Soil Party, really hit this, at least at first, this Republican idea. And the Homestead Act of 1862 said, any American citizen can get 160 acres of land, of federal government land, almost all in the West. And they get 160 acres, and if they show some kind of improvement, like build buildings on it, something, or farm it, they'll own it outright in 20 years. And that was the idea of the Homestead Act, to encourage small independent farmers. But one thing about the Homestead Act, it was pretty clear that the Great Plains and the West, 160 acres was not big enough. They would later double it to 360 acres. And the whole idea was for small farmers, but eventually speculators would come in. But most homesteaders who came west did not make it. They would go broke, and that would be part of the populist era. No, for the period 7 on the original review, I took some off because it was so close. So I don't want you to do the period 7 on the original review. That's why I gave the second one, so it's a little bit shorter. Because we literally just went over that, and so I thought I would shorten it down. But it's, it's not a bad idea to look at that original one, just kind of not even write it down, but just the period 7 on the original one, and just kind of say, oh, I remember that one, because there's a few not on there. But I tried to get the most important things in period 7. The big thing about that period 7 is hopefully it's fresh in your mind, and it should be a relatively clear. So let's get to Knights of Labor in the Haymarket Square. That's a good one. And that one's on, I believe, page, where's my mouse? Where's that one at? Oh, it's right above the Homestead Act. Okay, I was looking in the wrong direction. So Knights of Labor, that was one of the two big labor, or the styles of labor union that came about after the Civil War. And the Knights of Labor, that was an industrial union. Industrial union means all workers in. And so the not just skilled workers like the AFL. So the Knights of Labor Industrial Union, all workers. And the Knights of Labor, they were formed with this idea that the wage system was inherently unequal because wages had nothing to do with profit. And so as they looked at it, workers worked hard, yet their wages, especially in times of high unemployment, were kept low, and all the profit went to the owners, to the capitalists. And so they wanted a more cooperative system where the workers had a greater voice in production, which sounds a lot like socialism, which is the workers control capital. But they also wanted such things as better working conditions, 8-hour working day, basic things that the populists and the progressives and the New Deal would want. That's what the Knights of Labor want. But that meant they were a bigger threat than the AFL, which accepted the wage system. And so the Haymarket Affair in 1887, there was a big strike on May 1st for an 8-hour day. And even though the Knights of Labor wasn't directly for it, members were involved. And there were a couple of different instances of police violence, where police, which would routinely be used to attack and beat up labor unions and strikes so they would force them back to work. There are a couple examples. And so on May 4th at Haymarket Square, there was going to be a rally against police violence. And it was kind of a picnic and families were there. Well, police surrounded it like they always did. And somebody rolled a bomb into the police and seven police officers were killed. And the Knights of Labor were blamed. The Knights of Labor were blamed, and eventually, 5 police officers were killed. 7 would be arrested. 6 would be condemned, even though there was no evidence. But the media, which was anti-union, they said that the Haymarket Affair showed that unions were a bunch of communists. Just one sec. Okay, another question. Grant and the Credit Mobilier. Okay, Grant and the Credit Mobilier. And the Grant administration, he would serve 2 terms. And one thing about Grant, real fast, he did try to do Reconstruction. He tried. He made a noble effort. Grant was up and down. Oh, I'll come back to the cause of the Great Depression. Don't worry, I'll come back to that. But Grant's administration would be known for corruption. And the big thing about Grant is that Grant would begin, first off, this shift for various reasons to the Republican Party being more focused towards aiding big business, especially the brand new corporations. And he delegated a lot of government action to people who saw the government as a way to enrich their businesses. The most famous was the Credit Mobilier, a scandal that, yes, the government was directly involved, but the Credit Mobilier scandal was the Grant or the Union Pacific Railroad, which was getting very low interest loan money, so basically free money to build the Transcontinental Railroad. So the Union Pacific money was getting loans. The UP created a company called the Credit Mobilier to make the Transcontinental Railroad form. Now, so they made their own company. It's owned by the same people. And so the Union Pacific Railroad would pay the Credit Mobilier to make the railroad. So they're paying themselves using these low interest government loans. And so because of this, the Credit Mobilier was charging about a 1,000% or 1,000% overcharging what it cost to build the railroad. And so then the UP said, it costs more to build a railroad, we need more loans. And to get support and to keep people shut up, they gave members of Congress and members of the Grant administration stock in the Credit Mobilier company, so everybody was getting rich off of it. And so they could steal from the American public and pay themselves huge salaries. This would blow up in the face eventually of Grant, and anybody tied to the Credit Mobilier scandal would be politically hurt. And one thing about this showed how the Gilded Age politics was a marriage of government and business, how government would shield and help people get incredibly rich. And no one really got in trouble. Causes of the Great Depression. So causes of the Great Depression, that's the other sheet. And that's at the bottom. And I really did not give you much room, but you know, that's life. You have a margin there. Okay, so the causes of the Great Depression. And the big causes I laid out to you before were, first off, the inequality of wealth. Oh, I'm sorry, let's go overproduction. Number one is overproduction. There was huge overproduction in cars, especially, but also consumer electronics like the radio. And with overproduction, prices begin to drop and profits begin to drop, and companies try to make up the difference, produce more. You saw the same thing in farm goods too, but they're already in depression. And eventually what happened is companies could not make enough money. They begin to lay off workers, and that would begin the downward tumble towards recession, which actually began before the stock market crash. But it's overproduction. And the big thing about overproduction, there was so much reliance on selling of cars that once car companies couldn't make money, they began to shut their doors and lay off workers. That rippled all over the economy. If they can't produce cars, places like Akron, Ohio, where they made tires, all of a sudden they have 90% or 70% unemployment. Two, inequality of wealth. There's and because of trickle-down economics and other things, but money was focusing to the top. And what this led to is a big hole in demand. Eventually, people at the bottom cannot borrow any more money. They will eventually quit spending money, and those on top can only buy so many cars. And so this inequality of wealth leads to a massive economic ticking time bomb where demand will crash. And so you combine that with overproduction, got a real problem. Next, there was serious financial issues. There was no regulation of the banks, and so banks were making very risky loans, and this was fueling speculation, fueling massive speculation in the banking system. And because of this speculation, this led to the stock market bubble. And when the stock market crashed, Black Tuesday, 1929, when the stock market crashed, even though the depression had kind of already begun, but this would lead to a financial panic because banks had loaned so much money that they didn't have any reserves, and this led to a financial panic, a run on the banks, bank panic. The next big issue was debt deflation. Debt deflation is a big one. And debt deflation, just to review it, that is when if everybody tries to pay off their debt at the same time, because everyone had borrowed money. There was so much debt because people thought they were going to, the good times were going to go on forever. But if everybody tries to pay off their debt at the same time, that kills demand even more because people aren't buying products. They're paying off their debt. Well, if they're paying off their debt and not buying products, that means more companies have to shut their doors, and that means more unemployment, and that means more debt, and it cycles on itself. And it also leads to one more thing. If everybody sells off all their assets, like they sell off their stock or their cars or their goats or everything else, all at once, asset prices tank. And that's where you get a real estate tank and all that. And we're going to see this probably very soon. It happened in 2009, 2010, and I don't know, we'll see. And next, government inaction. The government, trickle-down economics maybe you could argue it might have led to some prosperity, but it definitely focused wealth on top, and without regulation, that helped lead to the crash. The Hawley-Smoot tariff in 1930, at a time when the U.S. needed to trade, the Hawley-Smoot tariff dramatically increased tariffs and led to a trade war and froze international trade all over the world. Also, the Federal Reserve should have been lowering interest rates, but it didn't do it. And lastly, there was no safety net. There was no help for the massive numbers of people laid off who could not spend money. And lastly, the last big thing was public confidence tanked. People lost their faith first in themselves, and that's when they thought they were failures. Families broke up. This was just an absolute disaster. But then people began to lose faith in their government, and that's where you get people, blaming. The Republican Party took a massive hit because of this, and you get the shanty towns called Hoovervilles, and then people began to lose faith in the system, and that's where you have growth on one side of the Communist Party, and on the other side, fascism. And that's the scariest thing. If people lose faith in the system, that is where you lead to it. It happened at the exact same time in Germany that led to Nazi Germany. It also happened in Japan that led to militarism. All right, wow. Next, We got okay, Great Migration. Where's Great Migration? It's right above trickle now. And the Great Migration, and this actually started just before the U.S. entered World War I and would go all the way through the 1940s. But this was a mass migration of African Americans leaving the South and going to the North. But remember, because of racism and sundown towns, they could only go to big cities, but that's where the factories were. And so it was a combination of them escaping the trap of sharecropping or kicked off of their tenant farms or sharecropping farms and going north. And yes, the North would be very segregated, and they would there was still intense racism, but there were more jobs. There were not Jim Crow laws. They could vote, and so this would lead to at least a more of a flowering of not only political and economic growth for African Americans, but also cultural growth, which would be personified with the Harlem Renaissance. Harlem, which is in Upper Manhattan, this would be where a lot of African Americans would move to in New York City. And so this flowering of culture and music personified by things like the Cotton Club or the growth of a kind of a wave of jazz music at that time. Next, double V and segregation. So H. Philip Randolph, the head of the Porters Union. Yeah, so it's near the bottom. Randolph, head of the Porters Union, a tireless fighter for equal rights and allied with the NAACP. Randolph is an amazing guy, just an absolutely amazing guy. Nobody deserves more credit for the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom than H. Philip Randolph. Everybody remembers Martin Luther King's speech, at least the last part of the speech, but it's Randolph. But anyways, Randolph was desperate to end Jim Crow laws and segregation, but not just Jim Crow laws, but also the segregation in the North that was not necessarily the law, but it was done by cultural practice and, well, partially the law. But he wanted to end segregation. So so not only separate facilities, schools, and buildings for African Americans, but also opportunities. It was almost impossible for African Americans to get a bank loan or get a mortgage. How are you ever going to build a business or buy a home and build any kind of wealth and security that way if you can't get a loan? So he desperate to fight that. And part of the double V strategy was double V or double victory, was that to get to fulfill the promise of equal rights, the double V would be victory at home by ending segregation. Not only Jim Crow, but the segregation in the North. So end Jim Crow and economic and political rights for African Americans, but also to get African Americans in combat. And the big thing about they're going to fight shoulder to shoulder with all other Americans is just like the thinking of Frederick Douglass during the Civil War. How can they deny people citizenship if they're willing to shed their blood for this country? Which it's, to me personally, mind-boggling that that happens. What's the next one? Oh, progressives. So the progressives near the top of that period 7 sheet. And the progressives, that was just give me a second. Okay, so another a little message thing came up. I might have to go to another meeting. No, but progressives. And that was a middle-class reform movement with the goal that capitalism must be reformed or there might be revolution. And that was the progressives' greatest fear. These were middle-class reformers who were benefiting from capitalism. They liked capitalism, but they wanted to make sure it survived. And the fear was if the inequalities and especially monopolies continued, it will destroy it and we'll either get fascism or communism. And so they wanted to reform capitalism. And so these were middle-class reformers who thought if we could get experts, the belief in experts to come in. And so that's where you get professional training and the idea of things like economists and political scientists. And they also believed in regulation. If they could set up rules a bare minimum for all companies to go by, this will alleviate some of the rough edges of capitalism. And so that's why they wanted things like food safety, worker safety, but the biggest regulation was antitrust. Remember, antitrust is anti-union. So that was the progressives. And their thought was that we could have a better society. And so that's where you get things like the muckrakers, reporters will look into some of the abuses of capitalism, like Ida Tarbell looked into Standard Oil. And you get things like attack on political machines, hoping to reform the political system, city manager and city managers and city council replacing the mayor city council system. So the idea is a professional city manager will run cities. State level reforms, like having citizens vote on laws, like in referendums and initiatives, or the direct primary, or secret Australian ballots. So hopefully those, you remember those, and then you get the progressive presidents. But the big thing, reform capitalism to save it. So those state level reforms, local reforms, and then progressive presidents. Spanish-American War. So there probably won't be a massive, well, if there is a question on imperialism, but the Spanish-American War, the justification was to help the Cuban Revolution, who were fighting against Spain. But then when the Maine exploded in 1898 in Havana Harbor, the United States blamed Spain for the explosion, even though they had no idea. And that would be used along with the De Loma letter, which criticized President McKinley. That was the Spanish ambassador to the United States, who sent a letter back to Madrid that was intercepted. The United States would declare war on Spain. And one of the big things that would come out of this, the Spanish-American War, was it would be pushed by the media looking for sensational stories, yellow journalism, like Pulitzer and Hertz, yellow journalism. Hope when I say that, it's like, oh, I remember that. And the United States would fight a relatively short war where they would defeat the Spanish, who were unmotivated, but part of that would be to get more imperial, to increase the size of the American empire, getting the Philippines, and would end with the Treaty of Paris, where the United States would pay $15 million to get the Philippines and Guam and the United States will get, backtrack. The United States would get Puerto Rico and Guam, pay $15 million for the Philippines, and Cuba would be independent. But this would make the United States an imperial power. Next, the Russian Revolution. So that's like 2/3 of the way down that 1890 page. And the Russian Revolution is also the Bolshevik Revolution, or the October Revolution. They're on the old calendar, so it happened in November. But the Bolshevik Revolution, and this was a revolution against by Bolsheviks who were very diehard communists, opposed to, led by Lenin, and they were opposed to the war. And they used the Russians being tired of war with the seductive slogan of bread, peace, and land. They overthrew a provisional government and they took power. This would lead to a horrible Russian civil war and eventually a totalitarian state led by Stalin that they would call themselves communist. But the Russian Revolution, the Russians pulled out of the war, infuriating the Western allies, including the US who just entered it. And this Russian Revolution, and now a successful communist revolution, would help fuel the Red Scare and the beginnings of the Cold War. Are there any more? Did we just cover a lot there? Just give me 1 second. I'm going to show you one thing really quick before we go. Yeah, I'm sorry I was a little bit late, but that's the way it goes. Sorry, I'm not getting this to work.
That was a great picture.
I'm going to show that tomorrow. So I'm going to give you a couple samples. I'm going to give you a sample DBQ. Tomorrow I'm going to do quick a little bit of the 18 or so I got to do a little bit of class. I'm only going to talk for I will do Gilded Age politics. I'm going to do 2 days of notes, but that's it. And so I'm going to ask everybody here to think about it, and tell me tomorrow, would you want a review session, one more review session on Wednesday or Thursday? I can go through, and that one I would go through everything. But I got that sample DBQ. I go through a few things. And I did get a question, what day do we turn in a review sheet for extra credit? Originally, I was going to make it Tuesday, but how about Wednesday? You get it to me by Wednesday at noon, I'll give you extra credit. I will give you extra credit. And this, I have no idea what the question will be on. It's, one question. I hate that, but then again, it's only one question. But if you have this in front of you, if you've done this, I'm convinced it'll help you. You have a quick review, you quick find it, get some context, it'll be right there, and hopefully trigger memories, and you'll feel better when you read the documents. I'm thinking another review session. How about, let me look at the test schedule for the AP, because I think there might be some conflict on Wednesday with people. And so maybe I'll do it Thursday. I mean, what the heck, day before. Good day to review. Let me ask, last one I'll do then, Gilded Age politics. So Gilded Age politics. Okay, that's near the bottom of page 5 on the left-hand side. And Gilded Age politics. Remember the Gilded Age, and that was the idea of this new kind of businessman called robber barons would take greater control over business, had more economic power, but it's a marriage of government and big business, where big business dominated the political system. And it was a dramatic shift from the Civil War to the end of to the beginning of the 20th century, where big business dominated and the dominant philosophy became social Darwinism. And the real big push would be for conservative economics, which then they called laissez-faire economics, where government aid for big business. They wanted government aid, breaking up labor unions and immigration, increase the market and all that, and government aid for railroads, government aid for business, but then no government interference, laissez-faire in competition. So let big business do anything they want to dominate the market and create monopolies. And so that's the example of Gilded Age politics, where big business became dominant. And that's where you get such things as the Sherman Antitrust Act, which actually didn't break up monopolies, even though it said it would. The ICC, that didn't regulate railroads like it said it would. And that would fuel the growing movements for some kind of alternative like socialism, populists, and progressives. And all the presidents would be very, using the term of the 20th century, conservative economically. Republicans became very pro-business, and Democrats pretty darn pro-business too. There wasn't a big difference. There's a good reason why today you could call Gilded Age too. It's very similar. Is that good? Okay, I'm going to look at the schedule and I'll let you know in advance. I'll let you know what day we'll do another review. But Thursday, I think there's no conflict, so I'll do it then. If there's no more questions, or would you rather do it? Let me look. I wouldn't mind doing it. I restate that. Let me tentatively plan for Wednesday. Wednesday at 10:30, I'll do another review. And I'll give you a last chance if you want to get any last ones in before I make it due for extra credit. And then Thursday, what I'll do on Thursday is I'm going to do a class, because why not? Just kind of keep things normal, and I want to do it. But I will keep my computer on and I'll keep Teams on. Maybe I'll just stick it on my iPad, but I'll keep that on. And so if you have a question, you can text me if we need to talk about anything you might want. But I'll make myself available that whole day afterwards, and I'll do the same thing for Friday morning. So Friday morning, I'll make myself available. I'll just have it on. If you have a question, but about 11 o'clock, I can't be. I'm supposed to like run away. I can't be around. Okay, if that's it, good meeting. We got a lot done. And once again, thank you for reminding me to record. All right. I am done. Goodbye.